For our next section, we're going to be discussing the effects of stressors on our health. And we're going to start by focusing in on the Diathesis-Stress Model. So this is a theory that mental and physical disorders develop from a genetic or biological predisposition for that illness, combined with stressful conditions that play a precipitating or facilitating role. And this is a fancy way of saying that if you are predisposed towards having a disorder, so maybe you have a genetic predisposition towards it, we would call that a diathesis. And then if we encounter environmental stimuli that sort of increase your likelihood of sort of expressing that disorder, then your chances of having that disorder are going to increase. And then so for a visual of this, we can look at this diagram here. On our x-axis here, we have our predisposition towards a disorder. So this would be our diathesis, our genetic component. So you may have a low risk of developing a particular disorder or a high risk of developing a particular disorder. And we can be looking at anything here from alcoholism to anxiety to depression to whatever trait we want to be looking at. And so that's our predisposition for the disorder. And so as we have a higher predisposition or a higher genetic component relating us to being predisposed for this disorder, the likelihood of that disorder manifesting is also going to increase. And then as our amount of stress increases, so as the intensity of those environmental influences goes up, that's also going to lead to an increased likelihood of us manifesting that disorder. So we're getting sort of this interaction where we need both a predisposition and an environmental interaction. Now, this visual doesn't really work for me and my sort of representation of how this works. I find it a little bit easier to use a diagram that I've used for a different class, and that's what's on the next slide here. And so this is the same concept, but just explained a slightly different way. So here, we're saying that our trait of interest, the thing that we're looking at maybe developing, is alcoholism here. So if we cross this threshold, we develop that particular disorder. We have a certain amount of predisposition due to our genetic vulnerability, due to that diathesis. And then we have a certain amount of predisposition due to life events, those stressors that we experience. And if we have sufficient interaction of both genetic vulnerability and life events, we might be bumped past that threshold and develop the disorder. So here we have an individual who has a fairly large diathesis. They have a fairly high genetic tendency to become alcoholic, and they also experience quite a few environmental stressors. So maybe long bouts of drinking in college, and that pushes them over the threshold and they would develop alcoholism. This individual has the same amount of stressor, the same exposure to long bouts of drinking in college, but their diathesis is a lot lower. They have less of a genetic predisposition. And as a result, these adding together isn't sufficient to bump them past that threshold, and they don't develop alcoholism. So we can have sort of more or less of the genetic predisposition and the environmental stressors, but what we care about is what the absolute combination of them leads to. Do we cross that threshold? Do we develop that disorder? So I find this diagram's a little bit more logical, at least for me. But if the graph here works for you, then you can think of it in terms of that as well. Now, despite the fact that there's lots and lots of research that shows evidence linking stressors with sort of health issues, and we're going to see a lot of different associations that exist, I always want to include a little bit of a disclaimer here, things that are important to keep in mind while we're going through this. Because at the surface, it can be kind of scary to see this idea that sort of exposure to stress can make you more likely to develop these particular disorders. But we want to focus on the fact that increased risk is not determinism. So just having an increased risk doesn't mean that you are for sure going to end up with a disorder. In a lot of cases, the disorders that we're looking at are very, very rare. And so even when we do see a statistically significant increase in risk, that might be an increase from, say, 1 in 1,000 likelihood of getting something to 1 in 500. So still very low odds. So a lot of these disorders are a lot more are a lot rarer than what we might conceptualize. So it's important to keep that in consideration. We also have this sort of knowledge of things that we can do to enhance our resilience to stressors. So even if we do have a genetic predisposition or a diathesis towards developing a particular disorder, we can actually take action to help reduce those risks. In the last section in this chapter, we're going to go into some of the actions that we can do, some of the resources that we have that can help us sort of reduce the effects of stress. We also want to keep in mind that most of the studies that we look at when we're getting these results are coming from observational studies. And so we're seeing that there are associations between different traits, but we can't be certain of causal relationships just due to the nature of how this kind of a study is conducted. So we're not saying that exposure to stress is causing that increase, just that it's associated with an increase. And in the same vein, it's also really difficult to control for confounding variables when we have observational studies, especially when we're looking at health. So we're going to have lots of other factors that are going on. There's a lot of things that tend to co-occur. So it's a lot more complex than maybe how it's presented when we start just sort of looking at facts and how certain things are associated with an increase in health problems. So just a couple of little caveats to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, because otherwise this can be a very, negative part of the chapter. So I always like to include that. The first concepts that we're going to look at are the relationship between stress and mental health. So, psychological stressors are widely recognized as risk factors for a lot of common psychiatric disorders. So, things like depression and anxiety are going to have sort of this co-occurrence, or they tend to occur more often when individuals have a lot more psychological stressors. And so we can say that our psychological stressors, in combination with an existing genetic predisposition, that diathesis, are going to have robust effects on the incidence of mental health disorders and mental health in general. So we tend to see that the more stress that we're under and the higher our genetic predisposition towards those disorders, the more of those mental health disorders we're going to experience. So we have sort of an increased likelihood of developing them because of those environmental and genetic predispositions. When we're looking specifically at depression, they seem to find very consistently in multiple different studies that stressors that involve social rejection are most likely to trigger issues of depression. So someone who experiences social rejection in their environment, they're going to be a lot more predisposed towards developing depression than those who don't experience social rejection. And they're also more likely to experience depression than those who have other kinds of stressors. It's just that social rejection is sort of the most intensive effect that is usually found in a lot of different studies. We also find that childhood stressors are often shown to be particularly harmful because they have very long-lasting effects. So again, numerous studies in a lot of different areas show that individuals who have very stressful childhoods, whether it's abuse or neglect or any kind of not great environment when you're growing up, that can have very long-lasting effects and can even influence your mental health as an adult and sort of throughout the rest of your life. So we're starting to see this general trend that more stress is going to lead to sort of worse mental health outcomes. And next we're going to start looking at stress and how it relates to physical health. So instead of just sort of a psychological disorders evaluation, how does it actually affect our physical health? And so we find that acute illnesses, so sort of short duration illnesses, things like getting a cold, they can last longer when an individual is stressed. And this kind of makes sense. So even though we said that when you have a stress response, at first it causes an increase in your immune response. If we're having sort of too much of a response, if we're sort of a very, I guess, sort of long-term stressors or something like that that has reduced our resources, we can end up having sort of a overall decline in the functionality of our immune system. So we can have illnesses that last longer and longer. So maybe you've had that experience where when you're working through the semester, maybe you're getting tired, you're not sleeping enough, you have lots of stress dealing with classes, and you get a cold. And usually you'd get over that cold in a couple of days, but because you're so tired and you're so worn down, you're going to end up being sick for days and days and days. It just drags on. So that's something that pretty much everyone is going to experience at some point in their academic careers. We also see that things like asthma attacks can end up being more severe when an individual is stressed. So again, they don't have enough resources to deal with sort of recovering from these asthma attacks. And we can even see situations where latent viruses, so things that we would carry in our system that might not have been affecting us, they can actually be reactivated if we encounter very stressful conditions. So again, as our immune response gets lesser and lesser, things that hadn't previously been a problem can crop up and start becoming a problem again. So we have lots and lots of different situations where as we experience more stress, and especially stress over long periods of time, we see actual declines in the functioning of our immune system. And this isn't just for acute illness. This isn't just for sort of short-term exposure. We also see that chronic illnesses, things that go over sort of many, many years, they can also be more severe when an individual is stressed. So you might be more likely to develop cardiovascular disease or have more severe cardiovascular diseases if you have long periods of stress. And then autoimmune diseases can also be influenced by stress. So if your body's immune system is sort of attacking itself, then you can sort of see the flare-ups of that as you have high situations of stress. So individuals where their bodies have sort of these long-term responses, they can end up having flare-ups during periods of high stress. And one of the massive studies that looked at this was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And so in this study, they looked at over 15,000 adults who reported their prior exposure to different kinds of childhood stressors. So things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse as children, witnessing domestic violence, and so on and so forth. And then they tracked these individuals throughout their lives to see what else they developed and what the correlation was with their previous exposure and how it affected their lives down the road. And again, we're just looking at sort of interactions or I guess associations as opposed to causal relationships. But we did see quite a few associations between sort of more severe stressors in childhood and then more severe outcomes as adults. So that same pattern getting sort of increased or sort of echoing throughout another topic. And then because of sort of long-term stress, we can actually start seeing that long-term stress can lead us to developing diseases and disorders, which makes sense with what we've been talking about. So chronic inflammation would be what happens when our inflammatory proteins in the body are sort of at higher than normal levels for long periods of time. So we had mentioned that in short periods of time, it can be adaptive and beneficial to have these inflammatory proteins throughout the body because it helps us heal and recover after encountering injuries. But prolonged exposure to these types of pro-inflammatory cytokines can actually lead to long-term damage to our cells. So it can trigger cell death or apoptosis, and it can also cause tissue damage. So we can end up developing diseases and disorders from this prolonged exposure because it leads to sort of long-term problems. So these higher levels of chronic inflammation can actually end up increasing our risk for cardiovascular disease and autoimmune diseases. There's also a lot of studies that are showing that inflammation is also related to functionality in different parts of the brain. And so there's a potential link between things like depression, anxiety, and PTSD and prolonged inflammation in the body. So this is another one of those. This is what they think might be driving some of these relationships. So prolonged exposure to these inflammation proteins might be what's driving the disease and disorders in the future. We also want to keep in mind that when we're having these sort of prolonged stress responses, it's also going to affect how we age. So normal biological aging is the tendency for reduced cellular performance as we age. So as we get older, our cells are less efficient at sort of reproducing and doing their jobs. So as we get older, we see sort of a natural decline in our bodies and in our functionality. So over time, we will sort of have less cognitive capacity. We will have sort of more aches and pains. We'll have less flexibility and so on and so forth. And so that's a natural part of aging. But when we have prolonged periods of stress, we can actually have sort of more aging. So we have sort of more intense and even premature aging. And so if we experience this more extreme than normal aging, we can end up with, again, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, and even neurodegenerative disorders. So there's lots of possibilities where things stop working and functioning and repairing like they should under prolonged periods of stress. And the mechanism that a lot of people propose for this process, especially biological aging, has to do with the telomeres on our chromosomes. So telomeres are DNA protein complexes, basically like a cap on the ends of our chromosomes that help protect against damage to the DNA that makes up our chromosomes. And I'm actually going to hop to the next slide because we have a visual here. And so the telomeres are these little caps that sit on the end of our chromosomes. And so as time goes on, when we're replicating all of our DNA, so every time a cell divides, so if we start with a single cell and then it turns into two cells, so if you've done sort of biology, you know that this is the process of mitosis. And so we start with one cell and then we end up with two cells, and each of them is going to have a copy of this chromosome. So we are replicating these chromosomes, but each time that we make a copy, there's actually a little bit of information at the end that's lost. And this is beyond what you need for this course, but it's due to the mechanism that we use to make those copies, which is basically if we have a strand of DNA that we want to make a copy of, we put down a little piece of RNA that allows us to start replicating. And so we would tap onto that and start going from there. But each time that we do this, we lose just a little bit of information at the end. And each time it doesn't seem like a big deal, but as lots of time goes on, we actually start seeing that these telomeres, they start shortening as we get older. And eventually, once these caps go away, we start eroding into actual encoding parts of the chromosome. So if we think about it, we would say that, okay, well, the blue is our DNA strand. And I'll grab, I guess we'll go back to pink here. So this part is our telomere. It's a cap, it's nonsense DNA, it's not important. Only the stuff that's after that, only the stuff that's over here is important. But if we keep sort of chopping shorter and shorter and shorter, eventually we're going to run through our buffer and we'll start losing pieces that are actually important and encoding for things. So the idea here is that once our telomeres go away, we lose that buffer. And as this shortening happens, it can actually start interfering with the functionality of genes. So as we get older, we're having more of this erosion, and we have more genes that don't get fully copied and therefore can't be fully functional. So that's the mechanism that they think is going on as related to biological aging. But there's so many more details we could go into for that, but we're just sort of getting the Coles Notes version here, that the telomeres and the erosion of those is what's driving our biological aging. And that process can be sped up through the course of being exposed to longer periods of stress, especially if we start thinking about things like inflammation leading to cell death, which requires us to have more cell divisions, which would then require more copies of our DNA, which would lead to faster erosion of our telomeres. So that's the process that we're getting at here.